It was total obliteration, a devastating series of strikes that had crippled Iran's regime and has set the stage for a war that will see the US annihilate any prospect of Iran being a major geopolitical player in the Middle East. Even US President Donald Trump can't believe how quickly Iran's regime has fallen, as the US has achieved the fastest victory in modern military history. All it took was 12 hours. And now Iran is on the verge of complete collapse. The US and Israel teamed up to launch a pair of operations running in tandem but with the same goal: take out Iran's dictatorial regime. Operation Epic Fury combined with Operation Roaring Lion to deliver an unbelievable amount of air power into Iran in a matter of hours, leaving an already struggling regime in tatters while taking out some of the key military nodes that might have allowed Iran to launch something that might resemble a strong enough retaliation to make the US and Israel think twice. The numbers are astounding. The US-Israel combined force conducted a staggering 900 strikes against Iran in just 12 short hours, in a shock-and-awe campaign that has shaken the entire country to its core. We'll be explaining how the US pulled off its 12 hours of destruction in just a few minutes, along with what the team-up between the US and Israel was designed to achieve. Along the way, the combined forces have destroyed Iranian air defenses, degraded Iran's ability to retaliate, and utterly ruined Iran's command and control capabilities, leaving the country little more than a husk of the military force that it once presented itself to be. The first blasts in Tehran were reported at about 5:30 p.m. Australian Eastern Daylight Time, the Sydney Morning Herald reports. Iranian Standard Time is about 7.5 hours behind that reported time, which means the US struck Iran at about 10 a.m. local time. About an hour after the first explosions were reported, US President Donald Trump announced that the US had begun major combat operations in Iran. What followed was another 11 hours in which the US and Israel battered Iran's defenses, leadership, and key military nodes. As Cappy Army notes in his report on the US-Israeli operation, the 12 hours of destruction wrought on Iran focused primarily on the most important city in the country, Tehran. There in Tehran is where much of the regime's command leadership is concentrated, Cappy Army says. And over the population hub, we can also see a surefire sign that the US and Israel are well on their way to achieving the sort of aerial dominance needed to boot Iran's ruling regime out of power forever. The airspace over Tehran has gone almost completely dark, which is precisely what we see in regions of Ukraine and Russia where air travel is being prohibited because of the sheer scale of the military forces being deployed in the airspaces of these countries. Iran International shared an illuminating map on February 28th that clearly shows civilian air traffic avoiding Iran altogether. Planes that might have flown over the country just 24 hours before are now being diverted to avoid Iran, along with other key hotspots such as Iraq, Kuwait, and Syria, that are both targets for Iranian retaliation and sites from which the US is launching its strikes. Oh, and one more thing. As part of its 12 hours of destruction, the US has also taken out Iran's supreme leader, Ali Khamenei. The man who has overseen Iran as it struggled to become a respected military and nuclear power is gone forever, along with hundreds, perhaps even thousands of his regime's followers and leaders. We'll be exploring what that means and why it set the stage for whatever comes next later in the video. But for now, we move on to two key questions. How did the US pull off its 12 hours of obliteration, and what roles did America and Israel play in what has to go down as the worst half-day in the entire history of Iran's brutal regime? We'll start with the how. The simple answer is the US used an overwhelming amount of firepower to annihilate Iran before it even had a chance to get out of the starting blocks in this war. We could spend hours going over every aspect of what the US did, but instead we'll focus on some of the heaviest hitters, starting with the Tomahawk missiles that the US unleashed in massive quantities from its warships. The over 20 American warships, including destroyers and submarines that have been built up in the region over the past few months, launched dozens of Tomahawk cruise missiles at their targets, Cappy Army reports. Some amazing footage has emerged of this Tomahawk blitz, including videos shot from the ground of America's missiles hugging the terrain as closely as possible as they hurtled their way to whatever they were sent to destroy. One such video shows 21 of these cruise missiles flying toward their targets one after the other, all clearly visible from the ground and all caught in a single video that lasts just over half a minute. Multiple impacts were reported at strategic locations, all of which Iran's air defenses, which are primarily made up of systems purchased from Russia and China, along with some built in Iran, failed to stop. That's where the low-altitude flight of the Tomahawks comes into play. The lower a missile flies to the ground, the harder it is for air defense systems and their radars to see that missile coming. There are concerns that the US has burned through more of its already limited stockpiles of Tomahawks during its 12 hours of epic fury. However, as Business Insider notes, the RTX corporation that makes the missile is already working to boost production to 1,000 units per year. And after this initial attack, the US has likely opened up the opportunity to strike with more precision using other missiles and munitions. Still, the Tomahawk played a crucial role in the first 12 hours. The same goes for the fighter jets that the US deployed from its nearby aircraft carriers and military bases. Capi Army reports that much of the initial 12-hour blitz of Iran's defenses were carried out by F-35s and FA-18E Super Hornets that took off from the aircraft carriers that the US is stationed in the Persian Gulf region. Their strikes hit an Iranian drone platform and multiple ballistic missile launch sites, Capi Army reveals. CNN adds that F-16s and F-22s have also been seen in action in the days that followed America's initial 12 hours of obliteration, as have twin-engine A-10 attack planes. America's jets also targeted Iran's limited naval facilities. Operation Epic Fury has cost Iran some of the most important assets in its navy, as reported by no less than President Trump himself. I've just been informed that we destroyed and sunk 9 Iranian naval ships, some of them relatively large and important. We're going after the rest. They will soon be floating at the bottom of the sea also, Trump declared. He added that America's overwhelming strikes also destroyed Iran's naval headquarters, before sarcastically adding, "Other than that, their navy is doing very well." Militani reports that satellite images have already confirmed the sinking of 3 of Iran's warships, including a light frigate and pair of corvettes. It also seems like 3 other vessels, including 2 patrol boats and an auxiliary ship, have also been destroyed. This is the last thing that Iran wants when its navy is already pretty weak. Global Firepower reveals that Iran had only 7 frigates and 3 corvettes to begin with. Though it still has its 25 submarines, at least as we know so far, the loss of any warship limits the naval power that Iran might have tried to exercise in the Strait of Hormuz. Let's slow down for a second, which is something we're sure that Iran's regime wished the US would have done on February 28th. So far, we've seen that America's 12 hours of destruction has taken out Khamenei, and there's more to come on that. US Tomahawks obliterated key military nodes throughout Iran, and the country's fighter jets have attacked key targets, including some of the few ships that Iran has that might present anything resembling a threat to America's naval dominance. Thanks to the US, Iran has lost its first warship since the 1980s, and there will almost inevitably be more to follow. But there is more, much more. Before we dig deeper into what else the US did in its 12-hour blitz, this is the military show, and there's a lot more where this comes from. Make sure you subscribe today if you're getting value from our content. Coming back to the barrage that was America's 12-hour assault on Iran, it wasn't just Tomahawks that Iran's regime had to worry about on the missile front. Beyond whatever the US fighter jets were launching by way of missiles and bombs at Iran, the US also made use of its ATACMS missiles. According to Military Watch magazine, footage released by US Central Command, or CENTCOM, revealed that ATACMS missiles fired from HIMARS launchers also targeted Iran. It seems likely that the US used these missiles to attack Iran's radars, further degrading the country's air defenses, along with ballistic missile launch sites that Iran might have used to retaliate against the US. Other footage upon which Military Watch magazine reports seems to show ATACMS missiles being used to take out a medium-range ballistic missile launcher, as well as an Iranian Barve 373 air defense system. These missiles would have had to be launched from the ground, as seen in the footage, and the US would have needed to have its launchers positioned fairly close to Iran's borders, given the maximum ATACMS range of 300 kilometers, or about 186.4 miles. This has led to speculation that the US took advantage of its military bases in Iraq or Turkey to complete this component of the 12-hour blitz. We don't know if that is indeed the case, as the US hasn't confirmed where its ATACMS attacks originated. However, they are the likely options, and the answer doesn't really change the fact that Iran has to deal with those powerful missiles crashing down on its territory, along with Tomahawks and everything else that the US and Israel unleashed as part of their attacks against 900 targets in 12 hours. With all of this firepower, it's easy to forget about another weapon that the US deployed during its initial assault on Iran, Lucas. These one-way attack drones are used by Task Force Scorpion Strike, which the US created in the Middle East toward the end of 2025. Operation Epic Fury marks the first time that this task force has been called into action on this scale, as well as the first time that Lucas kamikaze drones have been deployed. CNN says that the American drone is essentially a copy of the Iranian-made Shahed 136, and CENTCOM seems to confirm that in a statement. These low-cost drones, modeled after Iran's Shahed drones, are now delivering American-made retribution, CENTCOM declared. So Iran got a little taste of its own medicine to go along with the catastrophic display of pure American firepower that it was forced to absorb on February 28th. What we saw during America's 12 hours of epic fury is, simply put, the most impressive collection of US aerial might put into practice in years, or as CENTCOM puts it, Operation Epic Fury involves the largest regional concentration of American military firepower in a generation. There seems to be no denying that. And in a few minutes, we're going to dive into what all of this means for Iran and its regime. But first, it's worth exploring in a little more detail how Operation Epic Fury and Operation Roaring Lion worked together to utterly cripple Iran in just 12 hours. After all, though the US and Israel appear to have the same goal of taking down Iran's long-standing regime, each country took a different role during the opening stages of the conflict, and it might be argued Israel's role might have ended up being even more damaging to Iran and its prospects of putting up a fight in this new war. According to the Institute for the Study of War, or ISW, the US and Israel collaborated on a strategy that we can perhaps sum up as destroy and decapitate. Where America's airstrikes focused primarily on military targets such as the warships and ballistic missile launch sites that we've already discussed, Israel targeted Iran's leadership. It seems likely that Khamenei died as a result of the Israeli part of the 12-hour blitz, the ISW claims. Other major Iranian leaders that the Israeli Defense Force claims to have taken out include Ali Shamkhani, who is Iran's Defense Council Secretary, and Commander Major General Mohammad Pakpour of the Islamic Revolutionary Guard, or IRGC. Other major losses for Iran include its Defense Minister Aziz Nazirzadeh. All died in the first 12 hours of the war, and they were far from the only ones. Iran International adds that the ISNA news agency reports that thousands of members of the IRGC were killed or wounded due to the US and Israeli strikes against Iran's military centers. That figure doesn't seem to have been confirmed yet, and Iran International notes that the ISNA is only a semi-official source. Other figures, such as those shared by Al Jazeera, suggest that at least 555 Iranians have been killed by the airstrikes so far. That figure comes from the Iranian Red Crescent Society, and it's unclear if it relates solely to civilians or all Iranian casualties, including the country's leadership. So there is still confusion regarding the true scale of death that has occurred in Iran's regime as a result of the 12-hour blitz, but we can say one thing for certain: the regime is on shaky ground. And as the US and Israel follow up on their initial blitz, as the US has already done by unleashing its B-2 Spirit stealth bombers against Iran's underground missile facilities, that ground is going to crumble away. This is layered, synchronized air power at its peak, Max Afterburner says in his own roundup of the end of a war that has only just started. And this is what the US military was designed for, this type of synchronized approach to take down the integrated air defense system and allow the leadership to be struck. Again, it's the strategy that the ISW highlights. America took out the military nodes, and Israel focused on Iran's leadership, all in a 12-hour window that makes what we've seen at the start of the war between the US and Iran perhaps the most impressive display of military might yet seen in the history of modern warfare. But all this has already happened, and it's been devastating for Iran. The big and final question we have to ask is what will happen next. Trump has already offered us a hint during the 8-minute speech he delivered just an hour into America's 12-hour blitz against Iran. Our objective is to defend the American people by eliminating imminent threats from the Iranian regime. Its menacing activities directly endanger the United States, our troops, our bases overseas, and our allies throughout the world, Trump declared. In short, the complete collapse of Iran's ruling regime seems to be on the US and Israeli agendas, and if that's the case, then both have made a very good start. Khamenei is already dead. If the reports about the IRGC's losses are true, plenty of members of Iran's regime and military who might have been able to spearhead some sort of campaign against the US have followed Khamenei into the ground. The satellite images that have emerged of the ruined state of Khamenei's leadership house also serve as a massive propaganda victory for the US, as it will be able to share those images far and wide to showcase not only how powerful the American and Israeli air forces are, but how good their intelligence has to be for them to hit these kinds of targets so quickly and before Khamenei and his ilk could escape. That sort of propaganda could also inspire what the US may hope to be the next phase of the war with Iran, a rebellion against the remnants of the regime by the Iranian people. Cappy Army speculates that Trump has committed himself to his regime overthrow statements as a way of telling the Iranian people, who were protesting against that very regime in the months leading up to Operation Epic Fury, that the US will support them. If they rebel on the ground, the US may be saying that it will use its airstrikes to ruin whatever response Iran's remaining regime tries to formulate with more airstrikes. It's a case of passing the baton, in a sense, and the death of Khamenei so early in the war may have laid the foundation for an uprising fueled by people power. However, as Politico reports, such an uprising would have to overcome layers of repressive mechanisms that Iran has built over the last few decades, most of which won't have disappeared just because Khamenei is gone. The IRGC is still very much alive, even with the loss of so many members, and it's historically difficult to get rid of regimes that are as fundamentally rabid in their beliefs as the one that leads Iran. But then Iran's people are showing a major appetite for change right now. Perhaps they will heed the US call and be successful where others before them have failed, Politico says. One thing we can say with almost 100% certainty is that the US support won't extend to putting boots on the ground in Iran. Republican Senator Tom Cotton has already made that clear in an interview where he said, "The president has no plan for any kind of large-scale ground forces inside of Iran. An extended air and naval campaign that builds on the regime-shattering success of the initial blitz is far more likely," Cotton says, and the US will be hoping that whatever ground force is needed comes from the repressed people of Iran who have been crying out for regime change. There's another factor for Iran's regime to worry about: other states. The Times of India is already reporting that there may have been some form of sly cooperation between Israel and Saudi Arabia in the build-up to the initial 12-hour series of strikes. That cooperation may become more overt as the war goes on, as the Saudis have plenty of reasons to want to get rid of an Iranian regime that is unpredictable and has tried to make itself a power player in the Middle East. The UK has also announced limited involvement in the conflict, though this currently extends to offering the US the use of UK bases after it had previously refused. However, there is a broader consensus across most of the Gulf states that this war isn't their fight, as Al Jazeera reports. That's even though Iran has retaliated as best as it can against the US and Israeli strikes by launching limited numbers of missiles and drones at American bases in those Gulf states. But right now, things aren't looking good for Iran's regime. Its leader is dead. Most of its air defenses are shot, much of the IRGC has been destroyed, and the entire regime is in turmoil. The war may not be over yet, but in just 12 hours, the US, along with Israel, has set the stage for Iran to lose so quickly that it will be a marvel of modern military operations. Total obliteration has come for Iran's leadership. And interestingly, the fall of the Iranian regime may well have a dire impact on another leader who is thousands of miles away. Somewhere in Russia, Vladimir Putin is trembling at the thought of what a world without a version of Iran that is friendly to Russia will mean for his own regime. Why? We'll find out the answer in our video, where we cover what happens to Putin if Iran's leaders fall. And if you enjoyed this video, remember to subscribe to the Military Show as we cover the latest developments in Operation Epic Fury. And thank you as always for watching.